And next we will have Hideki Yoshikawa, who is an environmental activist and a director at the Okinawa Environmental Justice Network. He has been a leading voice in the campaign against US military bases and militarism, particularly around the environmental and social impact, which, for those who don't know, the US military is the largest single institutional carbon emissions emitter. And so to call for demilitarization is not simply to say we don't want to fight, it's also to think about how do we protect the limited resources we have on Earth that are already in huge disarray and disproportionately affect people who have nothing to do with these bigger struggles, whether it's small countries, Pacific Islanders, the East African coast. Those are the ones who are seeing the negative impacts of this increased carbon emissions that is directly tied to military spending. So thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Right. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mika, for kind words. Right. My name is Hideki Yoshikawa, and I am the director of Okinawa Environmental Justice Project. Our project aims to address and solve the issues related to U.S. military bases in Okinawa, Japan, from an environmental perspective. Today, I have 3 points to make. The first point, the overwhelming presence of the U.S. military in Okinawa has posed a significant threats to our daily lives and the environment. During World War II, Okinawa was a fierce ground battle site. More than 200,000 lives perished. That's including 1 in 4 Okinawans. The war also caused significant environmental distractions. After the war, the U.S. military took over people's land and converted them into their military bases. And Okinawa was placed under the U.S. military occupations until 1972, the year that Okinawa was returned to Japan. Today, although the Okinawa comprises less than 1% of the Japan's landmass, it hosts 90% of the U.S. military bases in Japan. Our land and the water have been contaminated with the chemicals such as PFAS from the U.S. military bases. People suffer from the deafening noise of the U.S. military aircraft flying overhead. We live in fear of falling objects from aircrafts and aircraft crashes. Our land and sea have been further damaged by the constructions of our new military base and facilities. And despite our repeated demand for the reduction of the U.S. military presence in Okinawa, our democratic voices have been ignored by the Japanese and the U.S. governments. So from our perspective on the ground, it is just clear the U.S. military has been destabilizing Okinawa for the last 79 years. Now, the second point. As the US and Japanese governments are propagating these China threats and the Taiwan contingency narratives, Okinawa and many parts of mainland Japan have been further militarized. Now this involves not only the US military, but the Japanese self-defense forces. That's what the Japanese government called the Nansei shift. Southwest shift is rapidly taking place. For example, in Yonaguni and Miyako and Yaeyama Islands, that's the outer islands of Okinawa Prefecture located close to Taiwan and China. In these islands, bases for the Japanese self-defense forces have been built, and the surface-to-ship missile systems have been deployed or are planned to be deployed. And recently, the U.S. military set up a radar system on Yonaguni Islands to monitor Chinese military movements. And also the joint military exercise, such as the Resolve Dragon, involving the U.S. Marines and the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force, have taken place in Okinawa and Kyushu and other parts of Japan. And they all focus on this countering China's aggressive maritime expansions. It is important to emphasize that this military cooperation between Japan and the US has developed over the last 15 years in response to China's growing economic power and military power. And it has fundamentally reshaped Japan's long-held post-war stance on peace. With Obama's administration advocating its pivot to Asia in 2014, then the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's cabinet and the National Diet allowed the reinterpretation of Japan's post-war peace constitution. Now, when an armed attack against Japan's ally, this case the US, occurs, and as a result, it threatens Japan's survival, Japan can use forces against the adversary in names of the collective self-defense. And 2 years ago, 2022, under the present Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, Japanese Ministry of Defense identified China as the greatest strategic challenge. And Kishida also announced that Japan would increase military spending up to 2% of GDP by 2027, abandoning the 1% cap that have been held in place since 1976. The way the Japanese government has militarized these outer islands of Okinawa and how local people are now reacting to this is very revealing. Japanese government proposed the deployments of self-defense forces and the missile defense systems to those islands as a means of self-defense, of course. And the local governments accepted them as a means of economic revitalization and a boost to population growth. However, the true nature of these militarizations has become more and more apparent recently. Earlier this month, Japanese government held a meeting with the local residents on Ishigaki Island to explain its evacuation plans in case of conflict with other nations. So it's implying China. Locals were surprised to realize that their islands could be actually targeted and that they might have to evacuate. At the same time, these evacuation plans have led many to believe that China's threats is real and the Taiwan contingency is highly likely. Now, the final point. Just like many other countries, local people in Okinawa have been holding meetings and rallies against these further militarizations. And we have also established networks with the anti-militarization movements in mainland Japan, which is very encouraging. To be honest, however, we feel overwhelmed and are overstretched. We understand that our struggle must continue even as a symbolic act, but we also realize we must seek effective ways to stop this further militarization. One framework we are examining in our efforts is the 1978 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and China. This bilateral framework, treaty, forbid Japan or China from treating the other as an enemy. It requires both countries to develop relations of perpetual peace and friendship and a peaceful coexistence. It requires Japan and China to settle dispute peacefully and refrain from using force or threats of force. It also declares that neither country should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region or in any other regions. It also declares that each opposes efforts by any other country or a group of countries to establish such hegemony. I hope we in Okinawa and Japan can utilize this treaty to counter the US and Japanese governments narrative of the China threats and the Taiwan contingency. I also hope the international civil societies in South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Hawaii, and Australia and pay attention to this bilateral treaty between China and Japan in their struggle against this destabilizing military force by the US. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know that often in these moments when we have to self-reflect on the challenges we're faced with and the work that still needs to be done, it can be quite overwhelming, but I'm highly encouraged just by having all of you who are joining us today. And we know that you guys all represent many, many other people who are active and committed to finding ways to peace and a people's-led peace that's centered in our daily lives, and the importance of making those collaborations known, I think, is part of the work No Cold War wants to continue to push and for all of us to continue to be involved in. So thank you so much for the intervention. Again, as sobering as it is, I still feel quite a bit of twinkle of hope just by seeing all of your faces here together.